"Where's our money, Della?" She stood in the middle of the yard, a bag still hanging from each hand, and the aunt who had raised her looked at her the way you look at a stranger knocking on the wrong door. "What money?" "I sent it home every month. For 5 years. You haven't sent a penny to this house in 5 years. Don't stand at my door and make up stories." Della Brennan was 27 years old, a waitress in Boston. 60 months of carrying plates in a diner that never turned its lights off. 60 months of burned hands and swollen feet. 60 months in a rented room in Dorchester, barely wider than the bed. Every single month she sent money back to Wickford. The hospital bill for Aunt Bertie's hip. Tuition for her younger sister Josie. New shingles for the roof after the winter storm tore half of it away. She sent all of it and kept nothing for herself but what she needed to stay alive. So that afternoon, when the bus let her off at the Wickford stop, she walked home with her chest full of something close to joy. Not rich, but proud. Proud that for 5 years she had carried her whole family on her back and never once let them fall. She pushed open the peeling wooden gate, and she knew right away that something was wrong. Aunt Bertie sat on the porch with her arms folded, her face hard as stone. Josie stood beside her, refusing to meet her sister's eyes. The man who had lived in that house for 6 years leaned against the doorframe with a leather notebook in his hand, watching her the way a hawk watches a chick. Her aunt did not stand up. She did not smile. She said 4 words that cracked something open inside Della's chest. "Where is our money?" And that was the moment Della understood that someone in that house had taken 60 months of her life, and she was going to find out exactly who. If this story reached you, leave a like so we know you're still listening. Share it with someone who has ever been called a liar by their own family. And subscribe, because what Della uncovered inside that house is far colder than anything you've heard so far. Della couldn't sleep that night. She lay on the old mattress in the room that had once been hers. The room where, for the past 5 years, the V-shaped crack in the ceiling had remained exactly the same, and she stared at that crack for a long time before reaching for her phone. She opened her banking app. Her finger moved slowly upward, scrolling backward, through 5 years of her life. November of 2021. The first payment. $800. She still remembered that day. She had been standing in the kitchen of the restaurant in Dorchester, her hands still wet, when she'd tapped the button to transfer the money, then had to lean against the wall for a moment, because she suddenly felt as though a weight had been lifted from her. March of 2024. $4,200. The largest payment. She remembered that day too. She remembered that day very clearly. She kept scrolling. July of 2022. $1,100. September of 2023. $960. February of 2025. $1,300. 60 entries. She counted them a second time to make sure. Exactly 60 entries. Not a single month missing. Not even the month when she'd lain feverish for 4 days in her 9-square-meter room and had to ask someone from the same boarding house to buy her a packet of noodles. She read through them the way people reread an old diary, except this diary wasn't written in words. It was written in numbers, and numbers didn't know how to lie. And yet, 4 hours earlier, the woman who had raised her had stood on the porch and called her a liar. Della sat up. She opened the message thread with the phone number she'd been texting for 60 months, the number she knew by heart even better than her own, and she began to type. She asked why Aunt Bertie had said those things in front of the neighbors. She wrote that she had all the records, that Aunt Bertie could see them anytime she wanted. All she had to do was say the word. She wrote that she didn't need an apology. She only needed Aunt Bertie to tell her that she believed her. Then she hit send and lay back down, still holding the phone against her chest. 3 minutes later, it vibrated. Della sat up so fast that the room spun around her. The message appeared on the screen. Long, carefully punctuated, every sentence beginning with a capital letter. Don't make a scene, child. Family matters should be handled inside the family. Don't let the neighbors hear any more of this. I know you're tired after your trip. Get some sleep first. Everything will be all right, sweetheart. Della read it once. Then she read it again. Then she read it a third time, more slowly, 1 word at a time, and she felt something faint move along her spine, something she couldn't quite name. The woman who had sat on the porch that afternoon hadn't been gentle at all. That woman had spoken to her harshly, calling her you in the cold, contemptuous way that stripped away every trace of affection, referring to herself with the blunt authority of someone putting another person in her place. Her face had been hard as stone, and she'd carried Della's 2 bags as though they were 2 sacks of garbage. But the person who had written these lines called her child, patient, thoughtful, the kind of thoughtfulness someone used when soothing another person, trying to calm them down. Della scrolled backward through the message thread, moving up through 60 months of messages. They were all like that. Remember to eat properly, child. Don't worry about things at home. I got it. God bless you. Not once had that number spoken to her with the harsh familiarity she'd heard on the porch. Not once. She sat perfectly still in the darkness, and somewhere in her mind a question began to take shape. But it was still too faint, too distant, like a sound someone had made in the room at the far end of the hallway, when you weren't even sure you'd truly heard anything at all. Outside, in Aunt Bertie's room, the light had been off for a long time. Della placed her finger on the screen and typed one more sentence. She wanted to ask, "If you believe me, then why did you drive me out through the gate in front of the whole neighborhood this afternoon?" She finished typing it. She stared at the sentence glowing on the bright white screen in the darkness. Then she deleted it, one word at a time, until the message box was empty. She didn't know why she'd erased it. Later, when everything was over, she would understand that some part of her had begun to doubt that night, and that part of her had been far wiser than she was. It had already understood that there were certain questions you shouldn't send when you didn't yet know who would be reading them. Della turned off her phone. She lay down in the darkness, and in the house she'd kept alive through 60 months of standing on her swollen feet, the first night passed without a single person coming in to ask her even one question. The next morning, Della woke before the church bells. She went downstairs to the kitchen and found Aunt Bertie already sitting there with her back to the door, peeling potatoes on the wooden cutting board her father had made before Della was even old enough to walk. Della didn't say good morning. She pulled out a chair and sat down, and for one very brief moment, she almost believed the afternoon before had been nothing more than a bad dream, because that back was still bent exactly as it had always been. That knife still moved with the same steady rhythm, and the smell of freshly peeled potatoes was still the smell of every morning from her childhood. She had planned to ask directly. She had spent the entire night thinking of 3 different ways to ask directly, but once she sat there, something inside her told her not to, the same thing that had made her delete the message the night before. So she asked something else instead, an indirect question, something she remembered only vaguely from the autumn of 2020, the day before she boarded the bus for Boston. She asked, "Aunt Bertie, did you ever open an account at Narragansett Savings?" The knife stopped, only for half a second. Half a second, nothing more. So brief that if Della had been sitting on the other side of the table, she wouldn't have seen it. So brief that if she'd asked in a harsher voice, Aunt Bertie might have been able to cover it with a shout. But Della was sitting right behind her, and she saw it. Then the knife started moving again, steady as before. Aunt Bertie didn't turn around. She said she'd never set foot inside that bank once in her entire life. She said, "You go off to Boston for 5 years and come back here with your head all mixed up? Della, first money, now banks. What are you going to make up next?" Her voice was hard, but her hand wasn't. Della looked down at the hand holding the knife, the hand with the long scar across the back from the time Aunt Bertie had helped Della's father haul in fishing nets, and she saw it trembling slightly. Not much, just enough to make the slice of potato she had just cut thicker than the ones before it. And Della understood something that made her feel cold inside for the rest of the morning. People didn't tremble when they lied to a niece about money. They trembled when they were afraid. She hadn't even had time to think any further when a voice came from the doorway behind her. "Did you sleep all right, Della?" Gerald Pruitt was standing there, one shoulder against the frame, the leather-bound notebook tucked beneath his arm as always. Della hadn't heard his footsteps. She didn't know how long he'd been standing there, and that was exactly what made her notice. From where he stood, he had heard her entire question. He came in, poured himself a cup of coffee, and said in that gently sorrowful voice he always used that she'd just come a long way. She'd spent hours sitting in a car, and when people were tired, they often remembered one thing as another. He told her she should rest for a few days and get her strength back, and then, if there was anything that needed sorting out, the whole family could sit down together and work it out, but there was no reason to rush. Then he placed his hand very lightly on Aunt Bertie's shoulder, and added that her aunt was very weak now, and Della shouldn't upset her. The moment that hand came down, Della saw her aunt's shoulder sink beneath it. It wasn't the sinking of someone being comforted. It was the sinking of someone who had just been reminded of something. Della watched the scene for exactly 2 seconds. Then she did something that, years later, would still seem strange to her, because she could never understand how she'd managed to remain calm enough to do it. She smiled. She nodded. She reached into the basket for a piece of raw potato, bit into it, and chewed, just as she'd done when she was a child, sneaking bites until Aunt Bertie slapped her hand away. She said maybe she really was tired from the trip, and that she'd catch up on her sleep today. Jerry smiled and said, "That's more like it." Aunt Bertie didn't turn around, but the knife in her hand began moving steadily again, and Della knew the woman had just released a breath she'd been holding the entire time. Della stood, carried the piece of potato with her toward the door, and on her way out she glanced toward the sink in the corner of the kitchen. Josie was standing there with her back turned, a dish towel in her hand. The water had been shut off for a long time. The bowl in her hand was already dry, but Josie kept standing there wiping it over and over, and her fingers were gripping the towel so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She didn't turn to look at her sister even once. Della walked out of the kitchen, and by then there was only one thought left in her mind, clear and cold as well water. There were 3 people in that house, and all 3 of them were afraid of something. She just didn't know yet who they were afraid of. Della didn't catch up on her sleep. She lay on the mattress all afternoon, eyes open, listening to footsteps moving through the rooms downstairs. And by the time darkness settled over the house, she'd made up her mind. She was going to ask in front of everyone, not to argue, but to watch what those 3 faces did when they all heard the same question. Because that morning had taught her that in this house, the thing worth trusting wasn't what people said. It was what they revealed in the half-second before they had time to speak. Dinner was served at 7 o'clock. The same wooden table, the same 4 places, except that the seat at the head of the table, the place that had once belonged to her father, now had someone else sitting in it. Della let the meal pass peacefully for a while. She listened to Aunt Bertie ask Josie about her shift at the laundromat, listened to Jerry complain about the electrician over on Post Road charging outrageous prices, listened to everyone laugh. Then she set down her spoon and asked. She asked that if the family hadn't received a single dollar from her for the past 5 years, then every month when she called home, who was the person telling her the money had arrived? The table went silent. Josie looked up, then immediately lowered her eyes again. Aunt Bertie set her soup bowl down harder than necessary. But Gerald Pruitt didn't look unsettled at all. He dabbed his mouth with his napkin, very slowly, then reached behind his chair for the leather-bound notebook. He opened it, turned a few pages, and began to read. He read that in January of 2022, the electric bill had been 42 days overdue, and they'd had to ask for more time. He read that during the winter of 2023, Aunt Bertie's blood pressure medicine and arthritis medicine cost $360 a month, and there were months when she'd had to cut her dosage in half. He read that the roof had been leaking since the fall of 2022, that a contractor had quoted $4,800, that the family didn't have the money, so all they could do was patch the eastern corner with 4 sheets of old metal roofing. He read each line one by one, neither quickly nor slowly, his voice as even as a man reciting prayers, and every number he spoke landed like another blow against Della's chest, because she remembered very clearly that in January of that year, she'd sent home $1,200, and that winter she'd sent money twice in a single month. And as for that roof, she'd sent the money to have it replaced 3 years earlier. Then he closed the notebook. He didn't raise his voice. He said in a sad tone, almost compassionate, that for 5 years he'd sat at this table recording every dollar that came into and went out of this house, and that he'd always told her aunt that the girl was struggling away from home too, that if she couldn't send anything then they would simply endure it, and no one should blame her. He said, "I've never blamed you for a single thing, Della." Then he looked straight at her and said the words Della would later remember one by one. "But for you to come back here, sit at your aunt's table, eat the food she cooked, and then invent a story about sending money for 5 years so you can demand it back from a 61-year-old woman who's been cutting her medication in half. That's heartbreaking." Della looked around the table. Josie opened her mouth. She drew in a breath. Her lips had already parted, and Della could clearly see that she meant to speak. Then her eyes flicked toward Jerry, very quickly, and she closed her mouth again. She lowered her gaze to her bowl of rice, and didn't look up after that. Aunt Bertie stood. She didn't say a single word. She went upstairs, and Della heard her footsteps enter the bedroom, heard the suitcase locks, heard her come back down. She passed the dining table carrying the 2 bags Della had brought home from Boston the afternoon before, bags that still hadn't even been opened, and she carried them out and set them on the porch. Then she came back inside, stood in the kitchen doorway, and said the only words she spoke that entire evening. She said, "You need to go, Della." Della stood up. She looked at her aunt for a moment, at that face hard as stone, and she searched it for the half-second she'd seen that morning. It wasn't there anymore, or maybe it had been hidden too carefully. She walked to the door without saying anything, and when she bent to pick up the 2 bags, it was already 9 o'clock on a November night. and the wind off the bay blew straight across the porch, cutting through the thin coat she'd bought at a thrift store in Dorchester for $12. She walked toward the gate. Across the street, someone in Mrs. Sutton's house pulled back a curtain to look out, then let it fall again. From the house opposite came the sound of a door closing, and as Della stepped through that peeling wooden gate for the second time in 2 days, she understood something. In a small town like Wickford, people didn't need a trial to change a person's name. All it took was one respectable old woman standing on her porch and saying a single sentence, and it was done. Della had gone to Boston 5 years earlier carrying the name Della Brennan, daughter of Tom the laborer. She'd been home less than 24 hours, and that name had already been replaced by another one. Della walked nearly 2 miles along Brown Street with 2 bags in her hands, and she stopped beneath the only neon sign still glowing in town at nearly 10 o'clock that night, the Blue Anchor. She'd waited tables for 5 years in Boston, and she knew exactly what an all-night diner needed. She pushed open the door, set her 2 bags at her feet, and told the old man behind the counter that she'd spent 5 years waiting tables in Dorchester, that she could work the night shift, and that she needed somewhere to sleep. Hank Osgood looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. He didn't ask whose daughter she was, and he didn't ask why a 27-year-old woman was carrying bags through town in the middle of a November night, even though in a town like this, everyone knew everyone. He reached beneath the counter, pulled out an apron, handed it to her, and said the shift started at 10 o'clock. Then he pointed toward the door behind the kitchen, where the flour sacks and cooking oil were stored, and said there was a bench in there. That was all. He didn't say anything else, and Della was more grateful to him for that than she was for the apron. The first 2 nights passed in the hiss of the coffee machine and the sound of trucks rolling through the night on the highway. Della waited tables, wiped down the counter, washed cups, and whenever her hands were free, she opened her phone and stared at those 60 transaction records, as though if she looked long enough, they might finally tell her where they'd gone. On the 3rd night, when the clock was nearing 1 in the morning and there was only one customer left in the diner, dozing in a corner, the glass door swung open. Josie stood there. She was still wearing her laundromat uniform, her hair tied back in a hurry, and she didn't come all the way inside. She stood in the space between the door and the counter, both hands hidden behind her back, her eyes flicking toward the window as though she were afraid someone might walk past and see her. Della told her to sit down. Josie shook her head. She said she could only stay for 5 minutes, that she'd lied and said she was going out to buy medicine. Then she brought one hand out from behind her back, placed a piece of paper folded into quarters on the counter, and pushed it toward her sister. She said, "Open it." Della did. Inside was a phone number written in blue ballpoint pen, the handwriting unsteady. Josie said, "That's Aunt Bertie's number. Try calling it." Della didn't understand. She said, "I already have Aunt Bertie's number. I've been calling her for 5 years." Josie said nothing. She just stood there and looked toward the phone, lying face down on the counter. Della picked it up. She opened the message thread with the number she'd been texting for 60 months, the number she knew by heart better than her own, and she placed the glowing screen beside the piece of paper Josie had given her. Then she compared them. First digit, the same. Second digit, the same. Third, fourth, fifth, sixth, still the same. At the 7th digit, the 2 numbers split apart, and from there to the end, the final 4 digits had nothing to do with each other. Della stared at the 2 numbers lying side by side on the stainless steel counter. She stared for a long time. She heard the coffee machine hiss behind her, heard the customer shift in his sleep in the corner, and she heard her own breath leaving her very slowly. She asked Josie which number belonged to Aunt Bertie, and Josie said the words that seemed to turn the whole kitchen cold. "Aunt Bertie never had that other number, sis. She changed her number in the fall of 2020, less than a month after you got on the bus to Boston. Uncle Jerry said scammers kept calling the old number and harassing her, so he went out himself and bought her a new SIM card, set everything up himself, saved all the contacts himself. She's old. She doesn't know anything about that stuff. Whatever he handed her, that's what she used." Della set the piece of paper down. In her mind, 60 months were suddenly running backward all at once. 60 phone calls, 60 gentle messages calling her child. 60 times she'd stood in the corner of the Dorchester restaurant kitchen, tapped send on a money transfer, then called home to make sure it had arrived. 60 times, a voice on the other end had told her, "I got it. God bless you, child." She had trusted that voice more than she'd trusted anyone else in the world. She pulled out her phone. Josie asked, "What are you doing?" Della didn't answer. She opened the old number again, the number that had belonged to those 60 months, and pressed call. She raised the phone to her ear. 1 ring, 2, Josie stepped back half a pace, her face turning white. 3 rings. Then, halfway through the 4th, the ringing stopped abruptly, and Della heard very clearly the sound of a call being answered. It wasn't voicemail. It wasn't a busy signal. Someone on the other end had just picked up. Della held her breath. For that half second, she heard exactly one thing. The sound of wind, or perhaps someone breathing out. Then the call went dead. Over the next 4 nights, Della called that number 11 times, and not once did anyone answer again. She sent messages. There was no reply. The gentle voice that had called her child for 60 months suddenly went silent on the very night she learned it had never belonged to Aunt Bertie. Then, on the 5th night, the rain came. It had started in the afternoon, and by midnight, the water had risen over Route 1A, where it ran along the bay, leaving drivers unwilling to risk the road, and the Blue Anchor had been completely empty since 11 o'clock. Hank had gone home at midnight, leaving Della alone with the diner glowing in the middle of a sleeping town. Close to 2 in the morning, headlights swept across the front windows. A black car pulled into the lot, parked at an angle, and 3 men stepped out. Della knew immediately they weren't night truckers. Night truckers came into a diner, dropped heavily into a seat, ordered right away, and talked loud. These 3 entered slowly. The man in front stopped in the doorway for exactly 1 second and took in the entire room before moving farther inside, and the other 2 didn't step ahead of him. 2 of them sat at the table in the farthest corner. The third took a stool at the counter. He ordered black coffee, no sugar. Della poured it for him, and for nearly an hour he didn't say another word. He simply sat there with his hands resting on the counter, occasionally looking through the glass at the rain streaming down outside, like a man waiting for floodwater to recede, rather than waiting for anyone to arrive. Della wiped the counter, rearranged the cups, cleared tables. She moved back and forth through the diner, and while she was standing beside the corner table to collect 2 empty cups, the 2 men sitting there were speaking to each other in very low voices, and she caught one sentence. She didn't hear all of it. She heard only 5 words clearly. One of them said, "The guy using our family name is still somewhere down here." Della's hand froze around the glass pot. She stood there with 2 dirty cups in her hands, and forced herself not to turn her head. She bent down and wiped the table one more time, as slowly as she possibly could, waiting for them to continue. But the man at the counter cleared his throat, very softly, and the other 2 fell silent. Della carried the cups back behind the counter. She stood there with her back to the room, her hands gripping the edge of the sink, while one phrase repeated itself over and over in her mind. The guy using our family name. She had heard that idea somewhere before. Not in those exact words, but the meaning had been the same. She had heard it for 5 years over the phone, from that same gentle voice, every time she was a few days late sending money. "Send it early if you can, child, before those people from Providence come knocking again." Near 3 in the morning, the rain began to ease. The man at the counter stood. He took out his wallet, placed money on the counter, and Della glanced down. Exactly $2.50, the exact price of 1 black coffee, not a penny more. Della had waited tables in Boston for 5 years. She knew how to read people by the way they left money on a table. A stingy person counted slowly and counted twice. A careless person tossed down a bill and walked away. Someone trying to buy her silence left more than necessary. But this man left the exact amount, placed neatly, and the way he did it told her he was the kind of man who didn't want to owe anyone a single cent, not even for a $2.50 cup of coffee at 3 in the morning. And that, not some generous tip, was what made Della lift her eyes and look directly at his face for the first time all night. The 3 men walked out. The door closed behind them. Della stood behind the counter listening to the car engine start in the lot, and she thought about 60 months, about the final 4 digits, about the call that had been cut off halfway through the 4th ring, about the half-second Aunt Bertie's knife had stopped in her hand. She thought about how she'd reached the end of the road she could travel alone. She didn't know who these men were. She wasn't even sure she ought to know. But there was one thing she knew for certain. If she let that car pull out of the lot tonight, she might spend the rest of her life without ever meeting another person who could say what she'd just heard. Della took off her apron. She left it on the counter beside the $2.50, pushed open the door, and ran out into the rain. She wasn't running after them to ask for a tip. She was running after them to ask one question. The rain struck her face the moment she stepped outside. The black car was already running, its red taillights reflecting across the pools of water in the parking lot, and the man who had been sitting at the counter was opening the rear door. The other 2 turned before he did. Della saw one of them slip a hand inside his coat, very quickly, then stop when he realized it was only the waitress, carrying nothing in her hands except her own 2 empty palms. Della stood about 5 steps from the car, her hair already soaked through, and raised her voice over the rain. She asked if there was someone using the name of a family in Providence to collect money from other people. The man's hand stopped on the car door. He didn't close it, and he didn't get inside. He turned around slowly and looked at her through the curtain of rain. Then he asked where she'd heard that. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut clearly through the rain, and Della realized he was the kind of man who spoke so slowly that everyone else had no choice but to fall silent and listen. She said she'd heard it inside the very house where she'd grown up. She told him there was a man who had been living in her aunt's house for 6 years, and for the past 5 years, whenever she was a few days late sending money home, that man would remind her, "Send it early, child, before those people from Providence come knocking again." She said she'd heard that sentence so many times, she knew it by heart. She said she'd been afraid of it for 5 years, so afraid that some months she'd worked 2 shifts back to back without resting just to make sure the money arrived on time. Then she added that now she'd come home, and her whole family was telling her she'd never sent them a single cent. The man stood still. He didn't say anything. Rain streamed from the shoulders of his coat, and he simply remained there, looking at her for so long that one of the other 2 men finally called him by a name Della couldn't quite hear. He raised one hand, only slightly, and the other man fell silent at once. Then he took 2 steps toward her and stopped at a distance, close enough that neither of them had to raise their voice. He introduced himself. He said, "I'm Salvatore Rinaldi." For about a second, Della didn't react. Then the name found its proper place in her mind, and she took 1 step back. She'd grown up in Rhode Island. She'd heard that family name since she was a child, heard her father mention it exactly once and never again, heard people at the fish market lower their voices whenever they spoke about Federal Hill in Providence. She knew what that name meant. She was standing in the rain at 3 o'clock in the morning, alone in an empty parking lot, and she'd just run after and questioned the very man people throughout the state avoided looking in the eye. He saw her step back. He didn't move closer. He stayed exactly where he was, both hands hanging loosely at his sides, and said, "Don't worry. I don't have any business in Wickford with you." Then he asked her a question, and his voice had changed now, lower, even slower. He asked the name of the man living in her aunt's house. Della said Gerald Pruitt. He repeated the name once, very softly, as if placing it somewhere for safekeeping. Then he told her something Della hadn't been prepared to hear. He said that for the past 2 years he'd been looking for a man who was using his family's name to frighten small business owners throughout South County. An auto repair shop in Narragansett, a Portuguese restaurant in Wakefield, an elderly woman selling knitted goods in Peacedale who had given him $3,400 before she finally dared tell her son. He said every one of them had described the same kind of man, soft-spoken, never openly threatening anyone, simply sitting down very politely and reminding them that the people from Providence would come knocking. He said that for 2 years he hadn't been able to find anyone willing to give him a name, because people were afraid. They were afraid of the very family name the man had stolen. Then he looked at her and said, "You're the first person who's given me a real name." Della stood there with rainwater running down inside her collar, and she realized her hands were trembling, but not from the cold. For 5 years, she'd believed she was paying a debt to the shadow of some organization in Providence. For the past 4 days, she'd believed she was searching alone for a thief inside her own home. And now, beneath that rain, she understood that she and the man standing in front of her had been traveling 2 completely different roads, from opposite directions, for 2 full years, only to arrive at the same name. 2 nights later, he came back. This time he was alone, and this time there was no rain. Della was wiping down the counter when she heard the door open, and she looked up to see Salvatore Rinaldi walk in, sit on the same stool as before, and order the same thing. Black coffee, no sugar. She poured it for him and stepped back, still holding the rag in her hand, waiting. She had spent 2 days thinking about what he might offer her, and she'd prepared an answer for every possibility. But he didn't offer her anything. He didn't promise to help. He didn't place anything on the counter. He took a sip of coffee, and then he began telling her a completely different story. He said, "My mother waited tables for 22 years on Atwell's Avenue in Providence." He said she worked the morning shift at an Italian restaurant, and every day she walked 4 blocks to work, even in winter. He said when I was 10 years old, one afternoon the restaurant register came up $400 short. He said the owner called my mother into the middle of the kitchen, in front of everyone, and asked her where she'd taken it. He said my mother told him, "I didn't take it." She said exactly that 3 times. "I didn't take it. I didn't take it. I didn't take it." He set the coffee cup down. He said not one person in that kitchen spoke up for her. Not because they believed she'd stolen the money, because defending her meant losing their jobs. He said my mother walked home that afternoon and she didn't cry. She just sat on the front steps for a very long time before opening the door, because she didn't want me to see her face the way it looked then. He said the following week they found the money. The owner's son had taken it. He said no one called my mother and asked her to come back to work. No one apologized to her. He said she went looking for another job at 3 restaurants on that same street, and all 3 had already heard the story. All 3 shook their heads. He said she died when I was 26, and right up until her final day, there were still people on that street who remembered her as the woman who'd been fired because of the missing register money. He looked up at Della. He said, "People can take a lot of things from someone, Miss Brennan. Money can be lost and earned again. A name can't." Then he didn't say anything more about it. He took out his phone, dialed a number, and made the call right in front of her. He said exactly 3 sentences. He said, "Aunt Rosalie, it's me." He said, "There's a girl in Wickford who had 5 years taken from her, and she still has the records." He said, "Listen to her for a little while." Then he handed the phone across the counter to Della. Della took it, her hand slightly awkward. On the other end was the voice of an older woman, rough, decisive, and not the least bit surprised to be receiving a call at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. She introduced herself as Rosalie Guerra and said she'd kept the books for this family for 30 years. She didn't ask Della how much she'd lost. She asked whether Della still had the transfer history on her phone. Della said yes. All 60 transfers were still there. The woman went silent for exactly 1 beat. And then Della heard her breathe out, the kind of breath someone lets go when they've just heard better news than they expected. She said, "Then you haven't lost anything yet, child. You just don't know how to look at it yet." She told Della to meet her at 9 o'clock the next morning at a bakery on Atwells Avenue, and instructed her to bring her phone, bring everything she still had, even the papers she thought were useless. Then she hung up. Della handed the phone back. Salvatore Rinaldi took it, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, and stood. He pulled out his wallet and placed money on the counter. Exactly $2.50. The exact price of 1 black coffee. Not a penny more. Just like the night before. And Della looked down at the money, then looked back up and asked him why. She asked why he was doing this for someone he didn't know. He had already taken 2 steps toward the door when he stopped. He didn't turn all the way around. He only said, "If what you need is money, I won't give it to you." Then he added, "But if what you need is the truth, I'll show you the road." The door closed behind him. Della stood alone in the brightly lit diner, still holding the rag in her hand, and for the first time in 6 days, she felt something in her chest that wasn't fear. At 9 o'clock the next morning, Della caught the first bus to Providence, and she had no trouble finding the bakery on Atwells Avenue, because it was the only place on the entire block with an elderly woman sitting at the table farthest inside, wearing 2 pairs of glasses, one over the other. Rosalie Guerra didn't stand to greet her. She simply pointed to the chair across from her and told her to sit down, ordered Della a coffee with milk she hadn't asked for, and then said the first thing she had to say. She said, "I'm not going to do this for you. I've spent 30 years sitting here watching money come in and go out, and I've learned one thing. Anything somebody else does for you, you don't truly get to keep. I'll only show you the right door. Knocking on it is something you'll have to do yourself." Then she told Della to take out her phone. Della opened her banking app and slid the phone across the table. Rosalie didn't pick it up. She pushed it back and said, "You press the buttons, child. I'll watch." She told her to open the first transaction. Della opened November of 2021, $800. Rosalie asked, "What do you see?" Della said she saw the date, the amount, and the status showing that the transfer had gone through successfully. Rosalie asked, "And what else?" Della looked up. She said, "I don't understand." The old woman removed the top pair of glasses, tapped one finger against the tabletop, and said, "Child, you've looked at this screen 60 times, and all 60 times you've looked only at the number. You've never once pressed the line beneath it." Della looked down. Beneath the amount was a line of small gray text, the line she'd skimmed past 60 times over 60 months without ever stopping, because every time she'd finished sending money she had to hurry back to table 4, table 7, table 9, because she was always sending money while standing, while rushing, while exhausted. She pressed the gray line. The screen opened a detailed transaction window, and on the recipient line were exactly 3 words, B. Brennan. Della stared at them. She opened the second transaction, B. Brennan. The third, B. Brennan. She kept pressing through them, 10 times, 20 times, her finger moving faster and faster, And every single time those same 3 words appeared, neat and clean, bearing the exact name of the woman who had raised her, Bernadette Brennan. Della set the phone down on the table and sat very still for a long time. For 5 years, every time she'd pressed send, that name had appeared right in front of her eyes, and because it had appeared there, she'd never once thought she needed to check anything else. People didn't go looking for reasons to doubt a name they loved. That was exactly what he'd counted on. He hadn't hidden the name. He'd placed it right in front of her, bright, correctly spelled, and she'd looked at it with complete trust for 60 months. She thought about the summer when she was 10, the 2 sisters sitting on the bow of the boat their father had just finished painting, their feet dangling in the water, their father sitting at the stern smoking and saying nothing. She thought about Josie at 6 years old, running after their father with a paintbrush, begging to help, managing one crooked stroke along the side of the boat, before dropping everything and running off to catch crabs among the rocks. She thought about how, back then, Brennan had been the warmest name she knew. Rosalie let her sit in silence for a while. Then she put her glasses back on and began telling her what had to be done. She said what Della could see on the phone was evidence, but it was soft evidence. Anyone could claim she'd fabricated screenshots herself, so she needed hard evidence. She told Della to go directly to her own bank, the bank the money had been sent from, and request copies of the transfer orders for all 60 transactions, with transaction codes, dates, and times, and the name on the receiving account. She emphasized that Della had the right to those records because she was the sender. The money was hers, and no one had the right to refuse her access to them. She told her to make the request in writing, keep a copy for herself, and make sure the bank stamped it with the date received. Della wrote down every word on the back of the bakery receipt. Then Rosalie sat a little straighter and told her one more thing, something Della hadn't thought of at all. She said there was another place Della needed to go, and she needed to go as soon as possible. She told her to go to Wickford Town Hall and request the ownership history for the family house. Della looked up and asked why the house. Rosalie Guerra folded both hands on the table and answered in the voice of a woman who had spent 30 years watching money come in and go out. She said, "Child, any man who can take something from people month after month for 5 years is never going to stop with the things that can flow away. Sooner or later, he's going to take the thing that stays in one place." Della got back to Wickford close to noon, and she went straight to Town Hall without stopping at the diner, without changing her clothes. She filled out the request for a certified ownership history, paid the $15 fee, and sat on the wooden bench in the hallway for 40 minutes. She'd prepared herself to wait several days, but in a town this small, there weren't many property records to go through, and they called her name sooner than she'd expected. She carried 3 sheets of paper into the hallway, stood beside the window, and began to read. The first page stated that the house at 41 Fairview Street, owned by Thomas J. Brennan, had been transferred to Bernadette A. Brennan in April of 2017. Della knew that part. Her father had done it 2 years before he died, and he'd done it in front of both daughters. He'd explained very clearly that if he ever had to go into a nursing home, they could take the house to cover the cost, and putting it in his sister's name was how he intended to preserve a roof over the heads of his 2 girls. Della remembered that day. Josie had still been in 10th grade. Della had sat beside her father at the kitchen table, and she'd nodded. She turned to the second page, and the words on that page left her standing motionless in the middle of the tiled hallway. It stated that the house at 41 Fairview Street had been transferred from Bernadette A. Brennan to Gerald M. Pruitt in May of 2022. Attached was a copy of the mortgage document, and at the bottom of that page, beneath the printed line, was Aunt Bertie's signature. Della read the date again. Then she read it once more. May of 2022. 3.5 years earlier. She counted backward in her head. And then she remembered that in May of that year she'd been working double shifts in Dorchester. She remembered because that was the spring she'd burned her left wrist when a coffee pot shattered, and she'd gone to work with it bandaged for 10 straight days. She remembered sending home $1,100 that month, which meant that during the very month she'd been waiting tables with her wrist wrapped in gauze so she could send money home to repair the roof. Back in Wickford, that roof had already stopped belonging to her family. She'd spent 3.5 years sending money to repair a house that was legally in another man's name, and she'd never known. Della folded the 3 sheets carefully and walked from Town Hall to Narragansett Savings at the end of the street. She sat down across from a young bank employee, placed her stack of receipts on the desk, and spoke very calmly. She said, "My name is Della Brennan. For the past 5 years I've been transferring money into an account held here under the name Bernadette Brennan. This is my complete transfer history, and I need to know what happened to that money. The employee looked at the papers, then at Della, and began typing. She typed for quite a while. Della watched her face as she worked, and nothing in it changed. No surprise, no discomfort. Then the young woman looked up. She said, "This account is still active, ma'am." Della heard those words and had to place both hands in her lap to keep them still. Still active. The account that, 4 days earlier, in her own kitchen, the woman who had raised her had turned her back and said she'd never set foot inside that bank once in her life. It wasn't dead. It hadn't been closed. For 5 years it had remained alive, breathing, receiving every month another breath drawn from Della's swollen feet in Boston. Della said, "Then I'd like the statements." And at that moment, the young employee's face changed, not with irritation, but with regret. She said, "I'm very sorry, but your name isn't on this account." Della said, "But the money is mine." The employee said, "I understand, and I believe you. But the law only allows us to provide statements to the account holder, to someone the account holder has authorized in writing, or to an authorized agency making a formal request." She said, "Even if you're the person who transferred the money into the account, once that money enters someone else's account, you no longer have the right to see inside it." Della sat without speaking. She stared at the computer monitor, turned away from her, the screen that only needed to be rotated 45 degrees for her to see where 5 years of her life had gone, and she understood that she'd reached the wall. She'd found the account. She was holding proof of what had happened to the house. She had 60 transaction records, and she still couldn't open the final door by herself. There was only one person in the world who could open it, the very woman who had stood on the porch and called her a liar. Della went up to Providence for the second time on Friday morning, and this time she carried more than a phone. She brought the ownership record she'd obtained from Town Hall, the copy of the mortgage document bearing Aunt Bertie's signature, and one more thing that had taken her 2 days to get, a copy of the account opening records from Narragansett Savings in 2020, which the bank had agreed to provide only as far as the specimen signature section after Della filed a formal complaint alleging that her money had been diverted for purposes she hadn't authorized. Rosalie Guerra was still sitting at the table farthest inside, still wearing 2 pairs of glasses, one over the other. She didn't ask how Della was doing. She simply pushed her coffee aside and said, "Spread it out here, child." Della laid the 2 sheets on the table side by side. The one on the left was the account opening record from the fall of 2020, with the signature Bernadette A. Brennan on the final line. The one on the right was the mortgage document for the house, dated May of 2022, also bearing the signature Bernadette A. Brennan at the bottom. Rosalie removed the top pair of glasses, bent close over the table, and looked. She studied them for less than a minute. Then she placed her index finger on the paper to the left, just beneath the signature, and said, "Look here," she said. "This stroke is forced. See this, child? The curve in the B stops, then starts again. Nobody stops their pen in the middle of their own signature. When people sign their own name, the hand moves. It goes straight through, because they've signed that name thousands of times in their lives." She pointed to the final stroke. She said, "And this part was written slowly, too slowly. Whoever wrote this was looking at something else and copying it, not signing." Then she moved her finger to the paper on the right. She didn't say anything. She bent closer and studied it longer, turning the page slightly so the light fell across the surface at an angle, and she remained silent. Della could hear the clock ticking on the bakery wall. At last Rosalie straightened up, put her glasses back on, and said, "This one is real, child." Della asked if she was sure. The old woman said, "I've spent 30 years looking at signatures. I'm not a court expert, but I can tell you what I see. This signature moves in one continuous stroke. It leans at exactly the angle the other one was trying and failing to copy. It has that little hook at the end that only comes when a hand has done the same motion so many times it no longer has to think about it." She placed the 2 sheets neatly beside each other again and said, "That man managed to forge her name well enough to open an account, but nobody forged this one." She sat down herself, and she signed it herself. Della left the bakery and climbed into the old pickup truck Hank had lent her. She put the key in the ignition. She didn't turn it. She sat there for a long time in the parking lot off Atwells Avenue, both hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight through the windshield, while a question began to take shape in her mind, the question she'd refused to let fully form for the past 10 days. Because for 10 days, she'd still kept one place inside herself where she could believe. She'd believed Aunt Bertie had been deceived too. She'd believed that half-second when the knife stopped in the kitchen had been fear, not dishonesty. She'd believed the woman who had carried her 2 bags out onto the porch was simply someone being led by another person's hand. But now, Inside the bag beside her, there were 2 pieces of paper, one carrying a forged signature and the other carrying a real one. And that real signature was the signature that had handed the dead brother's house over to a man who had only been living there for 6 years. No one had held her hand. No one had forced her. She had sat down herself, and she had signed it herself. Della took out her phone. She looked at the number Salvatore Rinaldi had dictated to her on the back of the bakery receipt, and she called before she could change her mind. He answered on the second ring and didn't say hello. He only said, "Miss Brennan." Della spoke quickly, her voice stumbling slightly as she told him about the 2 documents, about the real signature, about the date in 2022. Then she said something she hadn't told anyone, not even Josie. She said, "I'm starting to think my aunt knew. I think maybe she's known for all 5 years." There was silence on the other end for exactly 3 seconds. Then Salvatore Rinaldi said one thing, only one thing, slowly and clearly, the way he said everything. He said, "A guilty person hides things. A person who's been deceived backs away. Watch carefully what she does. Don't listen to what she says." Then he ended the call. Della remained in the truck for a while longer, the phone still pressed to her ear even though the line had gone dead, and she thought about that dinner, about the way her aunt had stood up and gone upstairs without saying a word, had carried the 2 bags out to the porch without saying a word, had spoken only 3 words the entire evening. "You need to go." And for the first time, Della wondered whether that had been the act of a woman throwing her niece out of the house, or the act of a woman pushing her niece away from something. Della drove straight from Providence back to Wickford, and she didn't return to the diner. She parked in front of the laundromat on Post Road, close to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right in the middle of Josie's shift, and pushed through the door into the roar of more than 10 machines spinning at once. Josie was bent over folding towels at the long table in the back. She looked up and saw her sister, and her first reaction wasn't relief. She looked toward the door. Della understood that glance, and she said immediately that she'd checked the entire parking lot. There was no one there. She placed the stack of papers on the folding table between the piles of white towels, and she asked a question she'd been thinking about the entire drive home. She said, "Josie, how far did you get in school?" Josie stood still. Then she said she'd dropped out in the spring of last year. Della asked why, and her sister, 23 years old, standing in the middle of the steady hum of washing machines, told her something Della hadn't been prepared to hear at all. She said, "Because Uncle Jerry told us you weren't sending money anymore." Della asked again. She said, "What did you say?" Josie set down the towel she'd been folding. She said that for years, Uncle Jerry had been telling everyone in the house that Della herself had asked him to manage the money for her, because she lived far away, and because Aunt Bertie was old and didn't know how to use a bank. She said he told them that during the first few years Della had still sent money regularly, but later things must have gotten hard for her in Boston, so the transfers became less frequent, and then stopped altogether. She said he'd even told everyone not to call and ask about it, to let Della concentrate on making a life for herself, because it was hard enough for a young woman to be far from home alone, and calling to ask her for money would only make her feel ashamed. Della listened to every word, and she felt the whole floor tilt beneath her feet. She asked, "So for 4 years you thought I'd abandoned the family?" Josie didn't answer right away. She lowered her head, and when she looked up again, her eyes were already red. She said, "I didn't think you'd abandoned us. I thought you were struggling so badly that you couldn't send anything." She said, "Once I was going to message you and tell you not to send any more money, but Uncle Jerry said if I did that, you'd feel guilty and borrow money just so you could keep sending it, and that would only make things worse for you." She said, "I listened to him." Then she said the words that made Della grip the edge of the folding table. She said, "I'm sorry, sis. For 4 years I always thought you were suffering more than I was." Della stood there and understood something she'd misunderstood completely for the past 10 days. She had thought her sister was silent because she was afraid. She had thought those white knuckles gripping the dish towel in the kitchen that day were the fear of a younger sister too frightened to defend her. They weren't. Josie had been silent because Josie loved her. He hadn't only taken Della's money. He had taken the way her own sister saw her, and he'd been clever enough to turn it into pity. So no one in that house would ever call Della and ask even one question. Della asked one more thing, the final question she'd carried back from Providence. She pulled out the mortgage document and laid it on top of the white towels. She asked, "Do you know why Aunt Bertie signed this?" Josie looked down at it. She recognized it immediately. She said, "This one I know about." She said that spring Uncle Jerry had sat at the kitchen table with Aunt Bertie for several evenings in a row, opening his notebook and telling her that their father had died, leaving behind a debt of $40,000. She said he told them their father had borrowed the money to repair the boat shop before he got sick, that the paperwork still existed, and that the people who were owed hadn't demanded payment yet, out of respect for the dead, but if they waited too long, they would take the house. She said he told Aunt Bertie there was only one way left, to transfer the house into his name, so he could mortgage it and pay the debt for them. Because a house in a woman's name couldn't be used to get the loan. She said Aunt Bertie cried for 2 nights. She said Aunt Bertie told her that she wouldn't let her brother die and still carry the shame of being in debt, that she wouldn't let the neighbors say their father had borrowed money and never paid it back. Then she signed. Della stood in the middle of the laundromat, surrounded by more than 10 machines turning and turning, and she heard their low roar inside her head like rising water. She had spent 10 days looking for a man who stole money. Now she was seeing something completely different, something planned with such cold precision that it made her skin crawl. He had used the name of her dead father to trick Aunt Bertie into signing away the house. He had used Aunt Bertie's name to trick Della into sending money for 60 months. He had stood in the middle, holding that leather-bound notebook, and made sure that 2 women in the same family never spoke one word to each other about money. One believed she was protecting the honor of her dead brother. The other believed she was supporting her entire family. Both of them were sincere. Both of them were telling the truth. And through all 5 of those years, neither one had known what the other was doing. Della looked at her sister and asked, "Josie, tell me the truth. Did Aunt Bertie ever tell you that I was still sending money home?" Josie shook her head. She said, "Never. Sis, she doesn't even know you ever sent any." The 2 sisters left the laundromat at 5 o'clock, after darkness had already fallen. Della carried the stack of papers. Josie carried her change of clothes, and they'd taken exactly 10 steps into the parking lot when they saw the blue pickup truck parked across the exit, its headlights still on. Gerald Pruitt was leaning against the driver's door with the leather-bound notebook in his hand, standing there in the unmistakable way of someone who had already been waiting for quite a while. He said, "Well now, look at the 2 sisters." His voice was still the same, gently sorrowful, full of concern. He said he'd come to pick Josie up because it got dark early this time of year. Della looked at him and said simply that her sister was leaving with her, and in the exact half-second after those words, Della saw the thing she'd been waiting 10 days to see. The kindness on his face went out. He didn't frown. He didn't grimace. It simply disappeared, the way someone turns off a light, and for that half-second there was nothing on his face at all. It went flat, and his eyes looked at her exactly the way a person looks at a piece of merchandise that has gone bad. Then the expression came back on. He smiled. He said, "Sure, she can go with her sister." Then his eyes dropped to the papers in Della's hand, and he said, "You've been to town hall, haven't you?" Della didn't answer. He nodded slowly, tapping one finger against the cover of his notebook, and said, "Let me tell you something," he said. "Your father was a good man, Della. I knew him before I ever came to live in that house. But good men fall on hard times too. And when people fall on hard times, they sometimes do things their children don't want to hear about later." Della stood perfectly still. He said, "This whole town still remembers Tom Brennan, the laborer, as a decent man." Then he tilted his head and asked in the gentlest voice he'd used yet, "Do you really want this whole town to know the circumstances your father was in when he died?" Behind Della, Josie drew in a very quiet breath. Della heard her sister's foot slide half a step backward over the gravel. Then she heard it stop. Josie didn't retreat any farther. Jerry kept talking in the same voice. He said, "I'm telling you sincerely, I don't want anyone to suffer, but you've only been back a little over 10 days, and already you've gone from the bank to town hall, digging up one thing after another. There are some doors, Della, that once you open them, they can't be closed again. You open one, and whatever comes falling down on someone's head afterward, are you sure you can carry the weight of it?" Della looked at him. She thought about 60 months spent standing on swollen feet in Dorchester. She thought about her wrist wrapped in bandages in the spring of 2022. She thought about the woman who had cried for 2 nights, then sat down and signed her own name to protect the honor of her dead brother, an honor the man standing in front of her had invented precisely so he could deceive her. And she thought about the younger sister powerful standing behind her now, the sister who had spent 4 years loving her and never once dared call to ask a question. Della stepped forward, placing herself fully between Jerry and Josie, and looked him straight in the eyes. She said, "Uncle Jerry, I spent 5 years getting back to this parking lot. For 5 years I stood on my feet 12 hours a day. I ate bread with sugar so I could send enough money home every single month. I've already walked through all 5 of those years, so one more step isn't going to scare me." Then she said the final thing, "And as for that door, go ahead and open it. I very much want to know what circumstances my father was in when he died. I've been waiting for you to open that door ever since I came home." Gerald Pruitt stood still. Then he laughed. He laughed out loud, shook his head, and said, "Girl, you really are Tom's daughter, just as stubborn as he was." He turned away, opened the truck door, tossed the leather-bound notebook onto the passenger seat, and climbed in. Della remained where she was, watching him, and then she saw it. Through the side window, in the yellow glow of the dashboard, he put the key toward the ignition and missed. He missed once, then a second time, before finally getting it in. His hand was shaking. The blue pickup backed out of the parking lot and disappeared around the bend on Post Road. Della stood there a little longer, her heart pounding hard, and behind her, Josie said softly, "Sis, in my whole life I've never seen anyone dare talk to him like that." Della didn't turn around. She kept looking toward the end of the street and asked her sister, "Did you notice his hand?" Josie said yes. Della said, "People's hands only shake when they know they're about to lose something," and she understood that from this moment forward, she no longer had any time to waste. For the next 2 days, Della didn't go home. She could have. She had enough documents in her hands to walk into that kitchen and slam them down on the table. She had the ownership record, the 60 transaction entries, Rosalie Guerra's assessment of the 2 signatures. But she remembered what Salvatore Rinaldi had told her over the phone. Watch carefully what she does. Don't listen to what she says. And she understood that if she carried that entire stack of papers into the house, the man with the leather-bound notebook would be in the room, and he would talk, and he was better at talking than she was. He'd been better at it for 6 years. She would accuse him, he would defend himself, and Aunt Bertie would once again have to choose which one of them to believe. She had already made that choice once, on that porch, so Della wasn't going to give her another chance to choose. She wasn't going to give her aunt her own words. She was going to give her something no one could explain away. On Monday afternoon, Della stood at the entrance to Fairview Street waiting for Josie to finish her shift, and she handed her exactly 1 sheet of paper. Only one, not the whole stack. It was the printed record of the transfer made on March 14th, 2024, $4,200, complete with the transaction code and the name on the receiving account. Josie looked at it and immediately recognized the date. She said, "That's the week Aunt Bertie was in the hospital for her hip surgery." Della nodded. She said, "Take this home, put it on the kitchen table, and leave it there. Don't explain anything. Don't argue with anyone. If Uncle Jerry asks, tell him I gave it to you." Then she told Josie to give Aunt Bertie exactly 2 messages, and she spoke slowly so her sister would remember them. The first was that the money in that transfer came from selling their mother's ring. The second was that if Aunt Bertie wanted to know where the money had gone, she should go to the bank and ask for herself, because the account was in her name, and she was the only person in the world who could open it and look inside. Josie stood there holding the paper and didn't leave right away. She looked at her sister for a moment and asked, "Sis, what do you think this is going to accomplish?" She said Aunt Bertie would only show it to Uncle Jerry. He would say something again, and everything would go right back to the way it was. Della looked toward the end of the street, toward the roof she'd sent money to replace 3 years earlier, the roof that had still never been replaced. She said, "I don't need her to apologize to me, Josie. I've spent 2 nights thinking about this. If I carry those papers into the house and start talking, then for the rest of my life, I'll only be the niece who went away and came back to argue with her aunt about money. I don't want to win an argument. I want her to see it for herself. Once you see something with your own eyes, no one can take it back out of your head." Then she added something that made Josie turn her face away. "Besides, for 5 years all she's ever done is listen to other people tell her things. It's her turn to look." Josie walked down the street. Della remained beneath the streetlight and watched her sister's figure travel the full 100 meters to the peeling wooden gate, push it open, and disappear inside. Della didn't follow. She stayed where she was. The living room light came on, then the kitchen light. Della watched that kitchen window, the one where from the street you could see only the upper half of the curtain, and she stood beneath the streetlight on Fairview Street in the November wind, both hands tucked into the pockets of her $12 coat, waiting. At 7 o'clock that evening, the kitchen light was still on. At 9 o'clock, a shadow moved back and forth behind the curtain. At 10 o'clock, she saw the tall man's silhouette rise and leave the kitchen, and then the light in the front room went out, but the kitchen light stayed on. At 11 o'clock that night, it was still burning. Della walked back to the diner, worked her entire night shift, and at 3 o'clock in the morning she walked back to Fairview Street one more time, just to look. The whole street was dark. Mrs. Sutton's house was dark. The house across the road was dark. The entire town of Wickford had been asleep for hours. Only one window was still glowing. The kitchen window at 41 Fairview Street. The kitchen with the wooden cutting board her father had made before Della was even old enough to walk. Della stood at the entrance to the street and watched that window for a long time. She didn't know what her aunt was doing inside. She didn't know how many times the woman had picked up that piece of paper and set it down again. She knew only one thing. People didn't sit alone in a kitchen until 3 o'clock in the morning because of a piece of paper they didn't believe. Bernadette Brennan left the house at 8:20 the next morning. She wore the coat she only put on when she went to church. She walked because she didn't drive. And she went nearly a mile from Fairview Street to Narragansett Saving at the end of Brown Street, leaning on the cane her niece had sent money home to buy 3 years earlier. The bank opened at 9 o'clock. She stood in line for 40 minutes. She didn't sit in the waiting chair in the corner, even though 2 seats were empty. When her turn came, she sat down in front of the young employee, placed her handbag on her lap, and said, "My name is Bernadette Brennan. I want to see the statements for my account from the day it was opened until today." The employee asked whether she had identification with her. She handed it over. The young woman began typing, and while she worked, she asked a perfectly ordinary question. "What date would you like the statements to begin from, ma'am?" Aunt Bertie said, "From the beginning, from the day someone opened it." The printer ran for nearly 3 minutes. The employee folded the stack of papers, passed it across the desk, and Aunt Bertie took it with both hands. She didn't open it right away. She walked to the tall counter against the wall, the place where people stood to fill out deposit slips, set the statements down, took her glasses from her purse, put them on, and opened the first page. The first page was from the fall of 2020, the day the account had been opened. She hadn't been there. She had never once set foot inside that bank. She turned the page, and from the second page onward, 5 years of her niece's life appeared before her in 2 columns. The column on the left was money coming in. November of 2021, $800. December, $950. January of the following year, $1,200. There was a deposit every month, not 1 month missing. The column on the right was money going out, $800, transferred out 22 hours later. $950, transferred out 31 hours later. $1,200, transferred out the same day. She turned the page, then another, 60 deposits, 60 withdrawals. Every one of them moved out within 48 hours, and beside every outgoing transaction was the same receiving account name, repeated 60 times across 9 pages. Gerald M. Pruitt. She reached the page containing March 14th, 2024, $4,200 in, $4,200 out. 19 hours later. That was the week she'd been lying in South County Hospital with a newly operated hip. The week she'd eaten only half of every meal because she believed there was no money left at home. The young bank employee would later say that the elderly woman stood at that tall counter for about 15 minutes without moving, and when she finally turned away, her face was white, but she walked perfectly straight, and she didn't ask anyone for help. That evening, Josie sent her sister exactly 3 words. "Come home, sis." Della arrived at 7 o'clock. She didn't go inside. She stood outside the kitchen doorway, hidden behind the hallway wall, in the exact place where she and Josie used to stand as children when they wanted to listen to the adults talking without being seen. And she listened. She heard Aunt Bertie say, in a voice so calm it was almost strange, "I have something I want you to explain." She heard papers being placed on the wooden table. She heard exactly 4 seconds of silence. Then she heard Gerald Pruitt begin to speak, still using that same gently sorrowful, caring voice, asking where this had come from, telling her to let him see it first, telling her she'd been fooled. She heard him slam his hand down on the table, one dry crack that made the kettle on the stove tremble. She heard his voice rise as he said paperwork could all be forged, that people could print anything nowadays, that whoever had printed this for her, was it that girl? She'd been back barely 2 weeks, and already she'd thrown the whole house into chaos. And then Della heard something she would remember for the rest of her life. She heard her aunt scream. That 61-year-old woman, the woman who 15 days earlier had stood on the porch and called Della a liar, screamed that the bank printed this for me. She shouted, "I went there myself. I stood in line for 40 minutes myself. I handed them my own identification. At 9 o'clock this morning, I stood at that tall counter inside that bank and read every word with my own eyes." Della heard the stack of papers being thrown, heard it strike someone's chest and scatter across the tile floor. She heard her aunt ask, her voice breaking now, "You tell me this. The month I was in the hospital? The month I ate half my meals because I thought this house had no money? That girl sold her mother's ring and sent home $4,200. And 19 hours later, where did you send it? Then she asked the final question, and she asked it slowly, one word at a time. How many times have you used my brother's name to deceive me, Gerald? Outside on Fairview Street, Mrs. Sutton's porch light came on, then the light across the street. A door opened. Footsteps moved toward the fence, and in the November darkness, one by one, the neighbors began to gather. Gerald Pruitt didn't leave quietly. Men who are cornered rarely do. He stood in the middle of the kitchen with the bank statements scattered around his feet, and he began to shout. He shouted that she knew nothing about pressure. He shouted, "Have you ever once asked me what I've been carrying? Who takes care of this house? Who goes out and pays the overdue electric bill? Who calls someone to patch the roof? Who drives you to the hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning?" He said, "I have debts. Do you understand? I had debts before I ever stepped into this house, and I always meant to pay everything back," he said. "I was going to repay every dollar. I just hadn't had the chance yet." Then he turned toward the kitchen doorway, where he'd just heard footsteps, and his voice rose even louder. He shouted, "And what has that girl ever done? She ran off to Boston for 5 years, left this old woman here alone, sent back a few dollars, and now she comes home acting like some grand lady, stirring up the whole town." And at that exact moment, Della walked in. She crossed the kitchen threshold, stopped in the middle of the room, and didn't look down at the papers around her feet. She looked straight at him. She said, "5 years isn't a plan, Uncle Jerry. 5 years is stealing." The entire kitchen went silent. Then Della kept speaking, and her voice began to break on the third word, because for 15 days she hadn't cried once, not once since she'd stood in that yard with 2 bags in her hands, and now it all came at the same time. She said, "Do you know how big the room I rented in Dorchester was? About 97 square feet. Once the bed was in there, there was nowhere left to walk. In winter it got so cold I had to sleep in my coat." She said, "There were months when I ate bread with sugar for 2 straight weeks, morning and night, just so I could send home another $200 at the end of the month." $200, Uncle Jerry," she said. "I remember the spring I burned this wrist. I wrapped it in bandages and went to work for 10 days straight, because if I missed one day, I lost a shift." Then she said the thing she had never told another living soul. She said, "The nursing school in Boston sent me an acceptance letter 3 times. 3 times, Uncle Jerry. The first time was in 2022. The second was in 2023. The third was last year." She said, "All 3 times I stood in the hallway of my boarding house holding that envelope, read it once, and tore it up. I tore it up right there so I wouldn't have to carry it into my room, so I wouldn't have to see it at night and start thinking about what might have been." She said, "I tore those letters up because I thought things were still hard at home. I thought my aunt still needed medicine. I thought my sister still needed to stay in school." Then she looked at him and asked in a voice gone raw, "I tore up those 3 letters so you could buy that blue pickup truck, didn't I, Uncle Jerry?" Gerald Pruitt didn't answer. Della turned toward Aunt Bertie and said the last thing she had to say, more softly now, almost as though she were speaking to herself. She said, "I don't regret the money, Aunt Bertie. I can earn money again. I only regret that for 5 years I thought I was carrying my whole family on my back, when all along I was carrying a stranger." Aunt Bertie sat motionless in the chair at the head of the table, both hands resting in her lap. She listened to every word. She didn't interrupt her niece once, and when Della finished, she remained seated for exactly 3 more seconds. Then she placed both hands on the table and pushed herself to her feet, slowly, because the hip she'd had operated on 3 years earlier still hurt whenever the weather changed. She stood upright in the middle of her own kitchen. She raised one hand and pointed toward the door, and she said, "Get out of my house, Gerald." He looked at her. Then the gentle expression disappeared completely, and this time it didn't come back. The face standing in the kitchen now was something entirely different. The face of a man who had just finished doing the calculation in his head and decided he still had the advantage. He gave a contemptuous little laugh. He bent down, picked the leather-bound notebook up from the table, brushed it off, tucked it under his arm, and said, "What house, Mrs. Brennan?" He said, "Say that again for me." Then he said the sentence that everyone in the kitchen, everyone in the hallway, and everyone gathered beyond the fence outside could hear. He said, "This house has been in my name since May of 2022. You signed it yourself." He looked around once, at the table, the stove, the wooden cutting board, then looked back at the 2 women standing in front of him and said, "I'm not the one who has to leave." At 7 o'clock the next morning, the 2 Brennan women walked into the Wickford police station. Aunt Bertie carried the 9-page bank statement. Della carried everything else. The woman who received them was an investigator named Ruth Ambrose, 55 years old, specializing in financial crimes, and she listened for 40 minutes without interrupting them once. Every now and then she turned over a sheet of paper, marked something with a pencil, then looked up and continued listening. When the two women finished, she gathered the documents into a neat stack and told them that this kind of thing happened more often than people imagined. She said someone goes away to work and sends money home. Someone at home is supposed to hold it, and in the middle there is another person who steps in to manage everything. She said most victims never find out. Then she looked at Della and said, "You're fortunate because you kept every single record." 3 days later, she called both women back to the station. She said, "I have a few things I need to show you." The first was the result of the fingerprint search. Ruth Ambrose placed 3 files on the table. She said, "This man has been Gerald M. Pruitt since 2019. Before that, in Norwich, Connecticut, he used another name. Before that, in Keene, New Hampshire, he used another one." She said all 3 cases followed the same pattern. An older woman living alone, a house with the mortgage fully paid off, and a relative working far from home and sending money back. She said in Keene, that relative had been a son working on an offshore oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. In Norwich, it had been a daughter working as a nurse in Hartford. She said neither case ever went to court. In Keene, the elderly woman died before she understood what had happened. In Norwich, the daughter became suspicious and called the bank. But just like Della, her name wasn't on the account, so the bank wouldn't give her the statements, and she stopped there. Ruth Ambrose tapped one finger against the file and said, "Miss Brennan, you're not the first person he's taken from. You're the first one who asked the second question." Then she brought out the second thing. It was an envelope. She said, "We found this in a metal box in the shed behind the house, along with several other documents." She pushed it across the table. The edges of the envelope had yellowed with age. It had never been opened. The postmark in the corner was dated February of 2021. On the recipient line, in rounded young handwriting, was the address of Della's rooming house in Dorchester, and on the sender line were 3 words, Josie Brennan. Della picked it up. She stared at that handwriting, the handwriting of her 18-year-old sister who had just finished high school, and her hands began to tremble. Ruth Ambrose said, "Open it." Inside was a sheet of lined notebook paper, folded into thirds, with less than 1 page of writing. Josie had written, "Sis, I don't know how to say this, but our family isn't getting the money you're sending. I asked Aunt Bertie, and she said there hasn't been any. I don't know how you're sending it, but please stop sending it, sis. Keep it so you can live." At the very bottom, she'd added one more line. "Please don't tell Uncle Jerry I wrote you this letter." Della reached the final line and had to put the paper down on the table. February of 2021. She'd only been sending money for 4 months. 4 months. If that envelope had completed the journey it was meant to make, if it had landed in the mailbox in Dorchester where it belonged, everything would have ended there. There would have been no 60 months. There would have been no 3 nursing school acceptance letters torn apart. She sat in silence for a very long time, and what closed her throat wasn't the 5 years she'd lost. It was the realization that for 4.5 years, she'd sat in Boston believing that no one back home cared enough to reach out to her, when from the very beginning, her 18-year-old sister had tried to tell her the truth. Ruth Ambrose let her sit that way for a while. Then she said, "There's one more thing," she said, in his statement. "He mentioned Thomas Brennan, and I think you should hear this from me rather than from him. Your father died of heart disease. The hospital records are very clear about that. There was nothing suspicious about his death." Then she said, "But during the winter before he died, he had chest pain several times and talked about going to Providence to have his heart examined. The person who advised him not to go was Gerald Pruitt. He told your father that heart testing up there would cost too much, that the family was already struggling, and that he should wait until winter was over, and then decide." She said, "By then, he was already the one keeping the household books." Aunt Bertie sat beside her niece, both hands gripping the straps of her handbag, and she couldn't say a single word. That evening, Salvatore Rinaldi called Della. He listened until she'd told him everything, remained silent for a moment, then said, "Miss Brennan, you only have to say the word. By tomorrow morning, he won't be in this state anymore, and you'll never have to hear that name again." Della stood outside the back door of the Blue Anchor, looking across the dark parking lot, and said no. She said, "If you do that, then for the rest of my life, I'll be the girl who had to ask someone else to frighten a man before I could get back what was mine. And my aunt will never know that she was the one who walked out and found the truth with her own hands." she said. I need him standing in a courtroom, in the light, and I need him to say it with his own mouth. There was silence on the other end for exactly 3 seconds. Then Salvatore Rinaldi said, My mother would have given the same answer. 3 months later, the Washington County Court handed down its ruling. They recovered $9,200 out of the $71,400 Della had sent home over 60 months. The rest had disappeared long ago, dissolved into old debts, into a blue pickup truck that had since been resold, into things no one could trace anymore. $9,200. Della sat in the lawyer's office listening as that number was read aloud, and she didn't cry. She only thought that sometimes, when 5 years of a human life were weighed and measured, that was all they came down to. But there was something else that was returned intact. The deed transferring the house at 41 Fairview Street was declared void because it had been signed on the basis of a debt that had never existed, and the house was restored to Bernadette Brennan's name, with a police officer present and the signatures of all 3 people in the family. That afternoon, aunt and niece sat together on the porch, the very porch where 15 weeks earlier Aunt Bertie had stood looking at her niece as though she were a stranger who had knocked on the wrong door. Aunt Bertie sat quietly for a long time. Then she reached over and took Della's hand, the hand with the old burn scar on the left wrist, and she said, There's something I've wanted to tell you since that day at the police station, but I haven't been able to say it. She said, I should have trusted my own blood more than a man who knew how to speak sweetly. He sat at our kitchen table for 6 years. He called me sister. He drove me to the hospital. And I trusted him more than I trusted the niece I held in my own arms when she was still a newborn. She said, I'm sorry, Della. I'm sorry that for 5 years you lived far from home believing that your own family thought you were a liar. Della squeezed her hand. She said, You didn't know, Aunt Bertie. He made sure of that. What matters is that now we both know. Josie came home from work, saw the 2 of them sitting there, set down her bag, and sat on the step beside them. Then she lifted her eyes and looked straight into her sister's face, without looking away, without turning toward anything else. For the first time since that afternoon in November, she said, Thank you for not giving up, even when everyone in this family made you feel as though you were the one who'd done something wrong. Then, one night near the end of spring, it rained again, Route 1A flooded again, and the blue anchor stood glowing alone in the middle of a sleeping town. The door opened, and Salvatore Rinaldi walked in, took the same stool at the counter, and ordered the same thing as always, black coffee, no sugar. Della poured it for him. He reached inside his coat, took out an envelope, and placed it on the counter. Della looked at it but didn't pick it up. She said, I already told you, I don't take money. He pushed it a little closer and said, Open it first. There was no money inside. It was an acceptance letter for the fall nursing program at Rhode Island, along with a small note in Rosalie Guerra's handwriting, telling her to submit the paperwork before July 15th, and adding that someone had already paid the first term's tuition. The rest you can handle yourself, child. I believe that. Della held the paper in her hands and stood there for a long time without moving. She said, Why are you doing this for someone you don't even know? Salvatore Rinaldi finished the last sip of his coffee, set the cup down, and said, 40 years ago, nobody did this for my mother. That was all he said. Della asked, Then how do you want me to thank you? He stood, took out his wallet, and placed exactly $2.50 on the counter, the exact price of 1 black coffee. Not a penny more, just as he had on the first night. Then he said, Route 1A still runs through here on Friday nights. He said, This diner has the best coffee in the state. Then he pushed open the door and walked out into the rain. Della stood behind the counter, holding the 4th nursing school acceptance letter of her life. The first one she didn't tear apart, and she smiled. For the first time in this entire story, she smiled. Della Brennan's story leaves us with something very simple. Once the truth is standing in the light, no one can push it back into the darkness again. People who exploit the trust of others aren't truly powerful. They depend on only one thing, that we're often too trusting to ask the first question, and too afraid to ask the second. And the most precious thing a person can reclaim in this life isn't money. It's the right to be believed by the people they love. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone who has ever been called a liar by their own family. Please subscribe to our channel so that each day we can listen together to more moving stories like this one. How do you feel about Della's story? What would you have chosen to do if you were in her place? Please leave a few words in the comments, because we truly want to hear the deepest feelings from your heart. We wish everyone watching this video strong health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.